Give us your take on what happened. It was rather historic, but I note that neither party really got more than about 26%.
Thank you, David. It's great to be back in the Bloomberg studio. It was an historic day. It's the beginning of the end of the Angela Merkel era. It was a great day for the center in Germany. It was widened and strengthened at the expense of the extremist parties. And it looks like we're going to have the first ever three-party coalition in German history, that is post-World War II history, precisely because even the SPD, the Social Democrats, only got around 26% of the vote. They're going to need two partners, as with the CDU, CSU, if they were to lead.
So is there any prospect at all at this point, in your judgment, of the CDU trying to form a coalition? Because there was some thought they might try it, even though they came out 2 or 3 percentage points behind the SPD. But then I saw that and I'm getting this right, CSU head said, no, don't even try it. You're number 2. You're not going to get a coalition.
That was, I think, the initial reaction from the CSU, that is the Bavarian party that is allied with the Christian Democrats. But subsequently, he said, no, let's give it a try. At the end of the day, the kingmakers here are going to be the Greens and the Free Democrats. And the Free Democrats are a strongly pro-business, low-tax, low-government regulation party. Greens are a bit more expansive on spending, particularly on the green agenda. So I think at the end of the day, the question is, will the SPD or the CDU-CSU be able to make a better deal, a better offering with the Greens and the Free Democrats? And the SPD, having done considerably better than they did 4 years ago, having come out first, even though by a narrow margin, will have the first bite at that apple. But I wouldn't entirely rule out the CDU-CSU being able to form a coalition at this point. The numbers are there. The question is whether the political deal can be struck.
So, Bob, you know Bloomberg well. You know our audience and what they're curious about. And that is, what difference will this make in terms of economic policy, in terms of leadership of Germany? As you say, both parties are pretty much in the center, one left of center, one right of center. What's the range? What's the over and under on economic policy?
I think this is good news for the German economy, the European economy, and therefore the transatlantic economy. The parties of the right and the left, who had some very extreme positions, both on economic and on political military issues. For example, Die Linke, the left party, which got below the 5% threshold and will not be represented in the parliament, was actually calling for Germany to leave NATO. So I think we are now running from center-left through the center to center-right. There are differences of opinion, certainly on spending, on what the Germans call the debt brake, how big their debt-to-GDP ratio can be, and on taxes. The one thing we know is that the Free Democrats, a very pro-business party, are going to be part of the coalition. I would imagine that Mr. Lindner, the head of that party, will make getting the finance ministry the sine qua non of his joining any coalition. And just a reminder, as finance minister, he has responsibility for the German budget. Interestingly, Janet Yellen is the only G20 finance minister who does not oversee her country's budget. So I would watch the FDP in particular. I would also say, if I could, for your audience, it's really important to note that after they go through the political process of forming the coalition, they write a very detailed coalition contract. That could take weeks, if not a small number of months. And I would strongly suggest that your viewers especially watch very closely what's in that contract, because these are Germans writing a contract. Once it's written, they're going to follow it, and they're going to follow it closely for the next 4 years.
So, Mr. Ambassador, put one of your two hats from before back on, whether it's ambassador to Germany or whether it's the number 2 at the Treasury Department. What does this mean for U.S. relations, the Biden administration's relationships with Germany?
I think you have, in either possible pairing of coalition partners, a group that is pro-European, pro-transatlantic. Germany, for example, is stepping into the chair of the G7 for next year. I think, though, we're going to have some Europeans, including the French President Macron, who would like to take more of a leadership role. The Germans are going to be focused for several months on getting their internal politics right. I think for a 3 to 6 month period, it may be a bit more difficult to engage the Germans than we would like to see, but I think they will emerge from it a pro-transatlantic, pro-American, pro-European country. And the question is, can we take that from rhetoric to results on difficult issues like NATO budget, some of the difficulties we've had on Nord Stream 2, what kind of relationship will we have with them, that is the Germans and the Europeans on China. But I think the fact that this election strengthen and widen the center in German politics is good also for the U.S. and the transatlantic relationship.
I want to pick up on one thing you referred to, which is the relations with China, because there's been some perception that Germany has a closer economic relationship with China than, for example, we do. They rely upon them for exports. Do you see that evolving with time?
I think Germany will always be deeply engaged with China economically. And by the way, David, not just the big German companies that we would know like Siemens and others, but the German Mittelstand, the backbone of the German economy, are very heavily invested in China. So that's a quite important factor. At the same time, there are significant concerns in the German politics, really in all parties, about some of the steps that the Chinese are taking, particularly with regard to Taiwan, with regard to Hong Kong, Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, human rights more broadly. And particularly if you take a look at a government that would include the SPD, the Social Democrats, and the Greens, you'd have two parties who have been very tough on the Chinese on human rights matters. So I think we have to find a way to work closely with the Germans and the Europeans on China. There's a Trade and Technology Council going on in Pittsburgh today between the U.S. and Europe, and they're basically saying we're not ganging up on China, but there have to be some rules of the road that the Chinese as well as we follow on both economic and financial and political military grounds. I think there'll be a good line of discussion with the Germans and the Europeans on China going forward.
And finally, I'm going to impose on you here, if I may, Mr. Ambassador. Go back in history, your experience with history here, because it's involving China more than Germany, in fairness. As you know, there's an issue now about whether the World Bank has sort of adjusted their evaluation of doing business in China, first with Ms. Georgieva when she was there, and now with Mr. Malpass. I know you didn't know anything about that. I assume you don't know anything about it specifically. But do you think over time those questions have become more political with respect to China on behalf of the World Bank and even the IMF?
David, you'll know this as a former member of the same law firm that I'm in right now. I cannot comment on that because, as has been noted publicly, the firm was involved in that investigation.